loads of questions coming in, really interesting from our listeners. Simon here asks, of the 335 new MPs, are there any that have been on the New Statesman's radar for a while? And who are the future big beasts that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Well, the answer is yes, there are some that have been on our radar. And actually, in one of our pre-election issues, we did a big feature called The Next Generation that picked out a couple of Labour candidates, 12 candidates, I think, that we thought were worth watching, and delighted to say that we were right, because a number of the ones that we picked out have already made it into the government, which is actually really unusual. Usually those jobs go to existing MPs. So who do you want to kick us off with, Hannah?
I'll kick us off with Georgia Gould, who, interestingly, before the election, I was hearing from both Labour Party apparatchiks and actually Conservative, there was a huge amount of respect for Georgia Gould. She's thought of very highly. So she led Camden Council, big council in London, which all the London councils are, since 2017. She's been elected for Queen's Park and Maida Vale. And she's seen as a really impressive woman who knows how to run something, and she's joined the Cabinet Office as a junior minister in the government. She's the daughter of Philip Gould, who was one of the architects of New Labour and is widely regarded as a brilliant election strategist. So lots of politics in the Gould family, but she herself has proved to be an excellent politician operating locally.
Yeah, and I think running a council at the age of 38 is a pretty massive achievement.
Absolutely.
I want to shout out to Sarah Sackman, who's now MP for Finchley and Golders Green.
You went out on the campaign trail with her?
I went out and knocked on doors with her, and she has been made Solicitor General, and she is obviously she's got a legal background. She comes from the same chambers as Richard Hermer, who is the new Attorney General, obviously someone who has been elevated to the House of Lords in order to take on that role. But she's got a background in housing and environmental law in particular. So that tells you something about where Labour's priorities are in that regard. And it's interesting, when I chatted to her, I found her very, very impressive. But she talked about what got her into politics was she was a newly qualified lawyer volunteering at Toynbee Hall, the East London social justice charity, essentially. And she was offering free legal advice to people who had been evicted, who had issues with their landlords, with debt, with mould, like all of those issues where people have been on the sharp end of failures of the state, essentially. And she said that was what radicalised her to get into politics. So I'm not surprised that she has been promoted up into that role.
Another impressive new female MP who's come into government, Kirsty McNeil. Really interesting because she's one of, a number of Labour new MPs who took seats off the SNP in Scotland. And her family background, her family were very, very involved with the SNP. She's gone into the Scotland office. Important to have people with experience of the portfolios they're going into. She's spoken of as being exceptionally bright, very, very clever. She chaired the IPPR, the left-leaning think tank. So again, the pattern that we're seeing is, as we've seen with the appointments of people who are not even politicians, people like James Timpson and Patrick Vallance, is real thought about where people are being placed. This is a government of talents, if you like. And the same goes for the fourth new MP that's been chosen to go into government straight away. Yeah,
Miata Fambula, who also has experience running a think tank, the New Economics Foundation. She's the new MP for Peckham. She was born in Liberia, and you'll know her, Hannah, because she was always on Newsnight explaining
very impressive
concepts and sort of arguing for a more left-wing economic agenda, essentially. And she has moved into the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So you'd imagine her being very closely involved with Labour's Green New Deal and all of the investment that Labour want to bring in to meet our energy transition targets. Yeah. We should also mention two other MPs who we have profiled on the New Statesman who haven't got ministerial jobs yet, but we would say keep an eye on. One of them is Torsten Bell, head of the Resolution Foundation, who George Eaton has interviewed, who's a very impressive economist and who has a real focus on economic inequality, in particular generational inequality, and some of the factors there that are holding Britain back. Yeah,
and we saw, didn't we, over the last 2-3 years, the Resolution Foundation just increasing in significance. And I mean, Torsten Bell, was always on television, on the radio. He's a really respected thinker. And I guess the final one that we would draw attention to is Yuan Yang, who former journalist at the Financial Times, at the FT, born in China, really fascinating upbringing, and an economist as well. So these are all people who are really have proved themselves in their previous careers, whether it be in politics or not, as being really good thinkers, of achieving great things. Really exciting that they've come into this new parliament, which is so different to anything we've had before.
And Yuan Yang, of course, is also a writer now, occasionally, for the New Statesman, and she's got a lovely feature in our last issue about community and growing up in China, and I advise everyone to go and read that.
Yeah, and we'll put these the Labour's Next Generation article and George's interview with Torsten Bell in the show notes. Got a couple of questions on polling before we wrap up. Here we go from Josh. Did the pre-election polls get it wrong? Labour's vote share of 34% was significantly lower than the polling averages. Seems like Labour's support was overestimated again. And voter X1, keeping your anonymity. Isn't it clear that public polling skews voting intentions, and shouldn't we then therefore ban them for the duration of the campaign?
Well, I think there are actually two sides of the same question, which is, does polling influence the way people vote, and does that then mean that the polls retrospectively have got it wrong? It's almost like polling is Schrodinger's cat, where as soon as you try and measure something, the act of measuring it changes it. So I think a couple of things. One, I think it does look very much like the certainty that there was going to be a Labour majority will have incentivised some people who would have voted Labour if the outcome was uncertain to go, I don't need to vote for Labour, I don't have to vote at all, or I can vote for the Greens, or I can vote for one of these independent candidates, because they were sort of certain of the outcome. And I think there's a similar thing going on as well with Labour and the Lib Dems. Tactical voting was so effective this time round, sort of the anti-Tory vote, that I imagine there are people who might have liked to vote Lib Dem, but they voted Labour because that was the candidate in their seat that had the best chance of voting the Tories, and vice versa. So it's very difficult to separate polling from voter behaviour, and I don't think that means that the polls were wrong. The polls clearly showed what we saw, which was very, very strong anti-Tory sentiment, and they showed the desire for a change of government, which is what we got. Yes, Labour's vote share was lower than some of the polls were suggesting, but Reform's vote share was also lower than some of the polls were suggesting.
I think the vote share might have been different, but actually the polls were pretty spot on. When you look at the seats...
The MRP polls.
Yeah, the MRP polls were I mean, completely within their margins of errors, they were very honest about.
The result that we got was at the slightly better for the Conservatives end than some of them, but they all published ranges, and the ranges were sort of 90 seats-ish to 130 seats, and the Conservatives got 120. So broadly, they got it right. And on the question of should the UK ban public polling for the duration of the campaign, I think that's a really tempting
My answer would be
idea.
no.
Your idea would be no. I know that
Freddie's would be yes.
Freddie's would be yes, but I think private polling for the parties would just take over instead. And I don't think more awareness of what's going on is bad for democracy. I think the key thing is the way the polls are reported, and we've tried very hard, I know other publications have as well, to make it clear what the polls are actually saying and what the level of certainty is. And the pollsters, I think, from all the polling companies, have been really good this time at publishing their methodology.
Yeah, I think the reporting of the polling has been excellent generally across the board. I mean, they've, as you say, they've all published their methodology. They've explained the range
where
and
the uncertainty
is. So I think there's been a lot of transparency in the polls.